everyone. Please could we welcome David Nicholls.
Hello.
We're very lucky to have you. Thank you
I'm
for...
very pleased to be here. I'm sorry the sightlines are I may stand up in a kind of sharpie kind of way later if it's too frustrating for people. But very nice to see you all. Thank you for coming.
So David Nicholls is a British novelist, screenwriter and producer, known for creating Rescue Me and One Day, and writing the screenplays of Far From the Madding Crowd and Patrick Melrose. He is the author of 6 novels, and his 3rd novel, One Day, became an international bestseller and has sold over 6 million copies worldwide, being translated into 40 languages and adapted into the Hollywood movie and the recent Netflix hit. He was the winner of the Audience Award 2006, the 2019 BAFTA Television Craft Award winner, and the 2018 British Screenwriters Award winner, and he has received 12 nominations, including being nominated for 1 Primetime Emmy. Not only this, he has also won many literary awards, such as the 2010 Galaxy Book of the Year Award, winner for One Day, the 2014 Specsavers National Book Awards for UK Author of the Year, winner for Us, the 2014 Man Booker Prize, longlisted for Us, and the 2024 Bollinger Everyman Roadhouse Prize, shortlisted for You Are Here. So I wanted to ask to start the interview by asking, what inspired you to pursue a career in writing and screenwriting?
Oh, well, it came quite late. I didn't really think of it as a practical idea when I was a kid. You know, I loved TV and film and fiction, and for me they were all the same thing. They were all story and character, and I was particularly obsessed with comedy at the time, but I watched everything and read as much as I could, read very kind of eclectically from my local library, just kind of sucked it all up. But I didn't really have any idea of there being this job of writing. It's a very vague career path. There's no real formal way of entering it, and I kind of threw all of my passion for that storytelling into kind of school plays, really. I didn't go to the theatre, but I loved the experience of putting on plays. I loved the kind of intensity of the sort of the company experience. So at school I did, I was the only boy who was prepared to be in the plays, so I always got good parts. And it lulled me into this terrible false sense of confidence in my acting, and I really could never at any point do it. But I loved being in plays, and didn't really understand where they came from or how they were written. But my intention up until I started my A-levels was to do science, was to go to university and perhaps do biology or possibly even medicine. At the very last minute I dropped chemistry to do English literature and did some physics. I can't believe I'm talking about my A-levels, but here we are. Physics, biology, English and drama. So a really kind of strange combination, a sort of slightly useless combination, but it did allow me to go to Bristol, where I read English and drama, and again still really had no sense of writing and of how writing happened and what a career path might look like, or what medium I wanted to write for. Writing wasn't really taught at university. It was the age of the devised show, and actually to sit by yourself and write a play and give it to people to perform seemed rather kind of old-fashioned. We were always in groups of 6 arguing and putting on terrible kind of dance theatre. It was awful, a lot of it. But so I never really got to stretch my legs as a writer. I never really had that thing of presenting the work to other people and saying, what do you think, or would you mind reading this play? And so, this is taking me somewhere into my 20s before I'd even thought about writing. Even then, because I wanted to be involved in the world of storytelling and characters, I persevered with acting. And for all of my 20s, I was a kind of bit part actor. I did a lot of understudying. I was in the general company at the National Theatre, playing kind of very small parts, 2 lines here, 4 lines there. But I got to work with amazing actors and amazing writers and to work on amazing texts. So I was the understudy in the very first production of Tom Stoppard's Arcadia. I was in the understudy cast, so I never went on stage, but I sat in the rehearsal room and saw this play come to life. And it was such a thrill to be in a room with someone like Tom Stoppard and all these extraordinary actors, Bill Nye and Harriet Walter and this Rufus Sewell and Emma Fielding, this amazing first cast, and to see this play come to life and to almost treat the play in a way that wasn't academic, but I was aware that, having studied English and drama, I could see the structures taking shape. I could see the characters taking shape. I could see how the jokes worked. And I realized that that was what I really loved about acting. I loved writing. And I suppose at that point, the first idea that came to my mind was that I might be someone who worked with writers. So I started to get jobs as a script reader for various theatre companies and then TV and film companies. So I read all the unsolicited manuscripts that came in, occasionally take meetings with writers to talk about their work, introduce them to directors. And that was just a way of earning money while I was waiting for the next acting job. By the time I got to about 29, I realized that the acting wasn't going to happen. I had a really great friend who I'd met at Bristol, a theatre director called Matthew Warchus, who wanted to try and turn a play into a film. Sam Shepard's Last Place in Pethard, great play. And he thought that because I'd read so many scripts, I might have an idea about how to go about that. You know, how to approach an adaptation, how to, you know, the play is mainly constructed out of 5 epic two-hander scenes. How do you turn that into something that feels cinematic? So for years and years and years, we'd tinker away at this script, and he would dictate and I would type, and it wasn't really my writing, but I was writing. At the same time, a friend who I used to write letters to when I was training as an actor in New York said, you know, you should turn some of the stuff in those letters into some kind of drama or comedy. And so I started to write about my experiences about being a failed actor and working in restaurants, and wrote a little sitcom, again, completely on spec, for no money, for a friend, just a classic half-hour ensemble sitcom. And around about the same time Simpatico got greenlit, this sitcom got optioned by the BBC for 200 quid. And suddenly I was in a rehearsal room reading it for the very first time, hearing actors speak my lines, and that was really exciting. And that wasn't until I was 31. And even then I worked for several years as a script editor, so working with other writers while I tried to get my own projects away. And it took a couple of years for me to financially be able to put script editing to one side and to write full time. It was a very long answer, but please do also think of, while I'm speaking of questions you might ask later, you know, about this process. And the frustrating thing about my replies will be that there really is no set path, and it can often take a very long time. But I finally managed to kind of have my scripts produced on television, and that began a slightly erratic career in TV. When that stumbled, I had to find something else to do again, and that's when I started writing fiction. And I didn't start writing fiction until I was 35, so quite a long way into my writing career. So it's been a very erratic path, and something that I came to quite late. I mean, now looking back, 31 seems very young, but I must imagine that to a lot of you thinking that might not be, it might take that long to get going. That might seem like an incredibly long way away. But it was a very erratic path, and it took me a long time to get the confidence to say, would you mind reading this? To feel that I had as much right to do that as anyone else. And so that I guess is the headline of that long, boring monologue.
Thank you so much, that was really interesting. What has been the highlight of your career so far?
Well, it's a huge thrill to see. I love working with actors. I mean, I really do. I often, for every now and then, you'll be frustrated by a performance or disappointed by a performance, but for the most part, it's really, really exciting. So to see really fantastic actors like, well, on one day, Leo and Amber Cole, or more established actors like Tom Hollander or Kerry Mulligan speaking the lines is really, really thrilling. And to collaborate with them and work with them. I'm not one of those writers, there are quite a lot of them, I'm not one of those writers who won't take any notes or won't interact or listen to actors' anxieties. I think because I was trying for a long time to be an actor myself, I'm quite sympathetic to their concerns about writing. But seeing actors, you know, perform your words better than you hoped is really always very, very exciting. And for me as well, as someone who grew up loving fiction, you know, finding my way into print as a novelist was a huge deal. But the first time you see someone up on screen saying something that you thought of independently and never imagined seeing it performed. That's always really, really exciting.
I think this kind of follows on. How involved are you with the directors, producers, actors and film composers when they bring your scripts to life?
Well, it was so interesting for you to introduce me as a producer, because again, if I had a very vague sense of how a writer became a writer, I really had no idea what a producer did. And it always seemed like for a long time I thought the producer was the director, but it was the same job. And as I've worked more and more in TV and film, I've now become a producer. I guess there are different kinds of producing. There's the producing which is very kind of practical, pragmatic, to do with budget, to do with location, to do with getting the thing done, getting it to length, getting it delivered to the broadcaster or the distributor. And I tend not to do any of that. You know, I duck out of budget meetings, and that kind of producing is often about making things practical and not stamping on the dreams of the writer, but tamping them down, saying, look, I'm really sorry, this can't be a crowd scene. I'm really sorry, we can't shoot this at night. I'm really sorry, if we put a rain machine on this, it's going to double the budget, we can't do it. There's that kind of producing, which I don't do. And if anything, that's the kind of producing I have to sometimes try and push against. But the other kind of producing, which is, I love this director's work, I'd love them to be involved, or this is a brilliant song, or can we see what it looks like over the scene, or I desperately want this actor. That I do get involved in, and get involved more and more as time goes by, especially in television. I mean, I haven't made a film for a while, for a long time in fact, but TV writers are far more commonly the producers as well. The whole business of running a room, the whole business of being a showrunner, that's very much an overlap between writer and producer, whereas in film, writer-director is a much more common combination. When you write screenplays, you can often feel a little shut out of the process. It's quite unusual, unless the screenwriter is very established and successful, for a screenwriter to have access to casting decisions, or to the edit suite, or to things like music. Whereas in television, you're nearly always one of the producers. So the recent Netflix One Day, I only wrote one episode. A wonderful writer called Nicole Taylor wrote most of the episodes. And but I still felt very much creatively involved because I was the producer. So I was able to give notes, I was able to suggest changes. We rewrote things together every now and then, and that is something I'm very grateful for, because in film, the director it tends to be the dominant role, and that can sometimes be frustrating.
You obviously wrote the wonderful story One Day, and what was the biggest challenge in adapting One Day into the original film, into the screenplay?
Yeah, it was just the misery of cutting. You know, it's just novels and movies don't really. Often when a book is successful, people say, well, when's the film coming out? And yet there's often a terrible mismatch between the form of a film and the form of a novel. You know, novels are often episodic, novels are often multi-character, novels very rarely have 3 acts. You know, all of these classic film structures often can't be found in a novel, which is why when novels are turned into movies, they often struggle, because the forms are completely different. You know, the classic Hollywood form is a protagonist who has a kind of a dream or an aim or an ideal or a mission, and who confronts various obstacles along the way in the form of an antagonist. And you know, there's always a low point at the end of the second act, and then a kind of series of all this stuff which many of you may be familiar with, which is very prescriptive and often feels rather formulaic. And novels very rarely follow that shape. So for me, the biggest difficulty was just matching the forms. Also, One Day covers 21 years, and I think, and a movie is usually about 100 minutes long, and that's 5 minutes a year. You know, it's going to feel like montage. It's going to feel like you're just kind of whizzing through. And of course, you can make some years 12 minutes, but that means the other years have to be 3. And it can feel that business of constantly cutting, both at script stage and then post-production stage is really grim. And it took a long time, and almost the invention of a new form, really, for us to find a shape that matched, which is episodic streaming television, specifically streaming television. I mean, you could conceivably have done one day on the BBC, but the episodes would have had to be 56 minutes long, and there could only have been 6 of them. So you couldn't do that thing, the structural thing of having one episode per year, which is, I think, for me, to my mind, the reason why it kind of works is because the episodic nature of a Netflix show and the episodic nature of a novel just match, specifically that novel, because it's so episodic, deliberately so. So sometimes stories don't work in another form because of this mismatch. And that I found, I guess with the movie, I was frustrated. When you have to cut stuff, the things that you cut are dialogue scenes and jokes, because the story can exist without them, and film is so story-led. And then you get to the end of the process and realize what you've got is just a series of story beats going bang, 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 one after another without any time to breathe. And the great joy of television is you're allowed to sit and listen to 2 characters talk for 6 minutes. Of course, there are exceptions to this. There are films like Before Sunrise, I guess, is the most obvious example where the slowness, not the slowness, but the intimacy and the pacing are absolutely part of the success. But usually a film is a kind of story machine, and that can be frustrating.
It's interesting to hear that you find adapting the novels into series more efficient than adapting them into films. I wanted to ask, since you were a producer on the Netflix show One Day, what were your priorities in producing this for television?
Well, I left most of it to, I do have to give most of the credit to Nicole, who is the brilliant writer, the head writer, along with the team of writers, and also to the directors, because, when it came up again, the producer who wanted to make it was an old friend of mine, someone I met when I worked in the theatre, and she said, "Do you want to write it?" And I thought, often looking back at your own old work, it's a bit like looking back through a photo album and thinking, who is that? What was I thinking? I started writing that book when I was 39, and I'm in my late 50s now, so it felt like it would have been written by someone else. And I often, when you've written the novel, it's very hard to escape the traps. It's very hard to escape the form that you've created, the nature of the scenes, the shape of the scenes. So, for instance, in One Day, the first chapter is a two-hander in a bedroom, and when Nicole adapted it, she actually took most of the material from the end of the novel and brought it forward. And I wouldn't have been free enough with the material to make that kind of radical decision. So when I got the script through, I was like, oh no, this is nothing like the book. You've taken all the best stuff from the end. This isn't going to work. And of course, what Nicole realized was that for the viewer, they're just going to turn off if it's a 40-minute two-hander. They're not going to be interested or engaged. And you need to establish the structure of the series, and you need to establish the fact that it's an ensemble, and you need to establish the variety of tone, and you need to establish a sense of scale, a kind of epic quality to it. So all of the changes she made, even though they're very, very, very different from the novel, and the first 12 minutes is not in the novel, that was the kind of open-minded creative thinking that a novelist can't necessarily apply to their own work. So I would respond to the question by saying my priorities probably weren't the most important thing, and the priorities of the team, the directors, the writers, the actors, was to kind of capture a tone and a voice and a feeling, rather than sticking slavishly to the written word, because often the most faithful adaptations are weirdly the adaptations which stray the most from the source material, and instead look for a kind of distillation of the source material rather than just copying out the dialogue. The biggest difficulty with adaptation is the novelist has access to inner voice and commentary on the action and observation, whereas the screenwriter really is limited to what characters say and what they do. words and actions, dialogue and action. That's the bones of a screenplay. And if you read screenplays, often you can be, I don't know how many of you are interested in screenwriting yourself, or even as a possible profession, or even just out of interest, but do read some screenplays, because often you'll be surprised at how bare bones they are. You know, if you put in too much internal process, if you tell the actor what the character is thinking, that all just gets scribbled out by the actor, because they'll want to provide that themselves. And when you're carrying out the process of adaptation, it's really, really, really hard to throw those things away, to throw away memory. You know, how often in a novel does a character think back to their childhood? On the screen, that's useless. It's completely useless. Self-criticism. Often in a novel, a character will say something and then castigate themselves for what they've just said. Well, an actor can perform that, but you can't put it in the script. You might put it in the stage direction, but you have to trust that the actors will find it. There's no metaphors in the screenplay. You know, there's none of that thing of characters looking at the skyline and thinking of a skeleton. You know, it's useless. I mean, that is useless, but it's also it's of no use to a screenwriter. So memory, a certain fluidity of time, you know, a fluidity of movement, all of those things that you have as a novelist, you lose as a screenwriter. And it's really worth reading screenplays to see just how pragmatic they are. They're an instruction manual. And more than that, they're an instruction manual that will be enacted entirely differently depending on who you give it to. You know, the same script given to 5 different directors will make 5 entirely different films. I mean, radically different films. So it's a very, very, very bare and interpretable. It's a terrible word, but it's a versatile, I guess, is a better way of saying it, document.
You've written screenplays for major films like Far From the Madding Crowd, which is, I think, my favourite screenplay ever. It's so good. And also TV series like Patrick Melrose. Do you have a consistent process, or does it vary depending on the medium?
With adaptation, my process is to learn the book, and I mean by learn the book, I mean really learn it. So that you're often a screenwriter. I hear quite often screenwriters say, "Well, I read the book once and then I threw it away, and then I just took the bare bones of the story." And I've never really done that. I've always adapted things that I adore and which are important to me, and which I want to live with for 2 or 3 or 4 years. In the case of Patrick Melrose, that took about 6 years from the meeting to the actual broadcast. It took a long, long time. So I read it and I read it and I read it. I cut out the pages and stick them to a sheet of A4 and annotate. I listen to it on audiobook and go for long walks, so that I know, so that everything goes in, so that I don't just limit myself to the dialogue, but I remember images or observations that won't necessarily find their way into the screenplay, but which I can carry in my mind while I'm writing the adaptation. So deep learning is the biggest part of it. And the other part is which is much harder, I think, is throwing things away. Certain things just won't work on screen. I mean, it's interesting to talk about Thomas Hardy, because often, I love Thomas Hardy, but there are moments of extreme melodrama. In Far From the Madding Crowd, there's the sequence where, what's her name? Troy's lover, Fanny, who dies in the poorhouse and is dragged there by a dog. Do you remember that scene? And it's even on the page, it's quite extreme, quite kind of ripe and difficult, and yet it's part of what Thomas Hardy is. These big emotional moments that verge on melodrama, and you have to recognize that film, because it takes place usually in a natural surrounding, and the acting style is particular and different, that melodrama won't really convert directly, and you have to find a version of it, and often that will involve cutting things that are just too much for the screen. That said, you can often be surprised by brilliant actors who can get away with things. Like we always struggled, that film was directed by a really wonderful director called Thomas Vinterberg, and we always struggled with the scene where Bathsheba has a long vigil with the coffin, and is so consumed with jealousy of the dead body, envy of this being Troy's lover, that she wrenches off the coffin lid. And you think, well, that's really something. I mean, that's really extreme behaviour. Will we be able to get away with that? And Thomas always said, oh, well, if it doesn't work, we'll reshoot it. But it kind of does work, and it's actually ultimately pretty close to what's in the novel. And so often you can be taken by surprise by those things. But yes, finding a voice, a visual voice, in the more, not naturalistic, but the more reality-based world of film and television, for a voice that on the page is often quite heightened, is a challenge. I always think that's the challenge with Dickens. I did make a film of Great Expectations, and I'm not crazy about it, because I don't think we found, the intention with that script was to fight against the cliches of that word Dickensian, you know, the broadness of the monomaniacal characters, the sort of stylized hyper British character acting. And everyone is very good in it, but I don't think the script found a way to make it more grounded. And maybe it was a mistake to try and make it more grounded, because, you know, it does have elements of the gothic and the supernatural and the extreme. So I don't think I, as a screenwriter, ever quite found a way of transferring that, how I read Dickens onto this page in the screenplay.
And how do you approach writing adaptations of like Great Expectations, Far From the Madding Crowd, Tess of the D'Urbervilles for film?
I guess I talk a lot with the directors as well. I mean, I kind of learn them and break them down, and you have to do a lot of, one of the great frustrations with screenwriting is they don't let you just go away and write them. You have to have a lot of script meetings where you break down the story and work out what you're going to cut and what you're going to keep. And then there's a later process where, I mean, the first cut of Far From the Madding Crowd, for instance, was undoubtedly 2.5 hours long, and the finished film is, I think, just a shade under 2 hours. So that process is another kind of writing, the bit where you say, we're going to have to lose this whole character, we're going to have to lose this whole story. In the Netflix version of One Day, there was a whole, you know, Dexter had a new girlfriend in the final episode, and she was a wonderful actress, and she gave a beautiful performance, and it all got cut and near this sweet. So that's another element of screenwriting that doesn't necessarily exist in fiction. I do, as a novelist, get a lot of notes and a lot of brilliant edits from my collaborators, but broadly speaking, I'm in control. Whereas with screenwriting, you have to let some of that responsibility pass to other people.
How do you get creative inspiration when writing?
Oh, it's really hard. I mean, we were talking earlier. At the moment, I've just handed in 2 bits of work, and in theory, I'm kind of on holiday, and yet I'm very anxious about what will come next, and what, you know, I have to write another novel. I'm contracted to write another novel. I love writing fiction. I'm desperate to get on with it, but I've learned from experience it's very hard. You can't write an idea you don't have. That whole kind of automatic writing, you know, that business of just writing a kind of stream of consciousness and hoping that something will stick. A lot of novelists use that approach, and they sit down and write, you know, 500 words a day and go back to it and see if there's anything that they want to develop further. And I've never really been able to write like that. I've tried that kind of just writing against the clock, just producing a great volume of words, and it's all rubbish often for me. Whereas, you know, I can name lots of novelists who start with an image or start with a sentence and take it for a walk and improvise, and I've never been able to do that. So for me, often the starting point will be an atmosphere, or the last novel, the starting point for that was a kind of post-COVID spring, that feeling that we all had of stepping back out into the world and being a little bit frightened of the world. That was the starting point. The novel before that was a novel called Sweet Sorrow, which I wanted to feel like the last day of summer, you know, the last day of August, when you've got to face up to the real world and the summer hasn't quite been what you wanted it to be. So often the germ will be a mood, a season, often something I've read or seen. You know, I think writers need to confess, you know, how much they're influenced by other stuff, and how much they kind of, you know, often you read a novel and you think, I really want to write something like that. I really want to create that feeling in a similar feeling. You can never create the same feeling. I want to create a similar feeling in a reader or a viewer. So often that's why it's important for all writers, I think, to just consume as much as you can, because you will use it as fuel in ways that you're not immediately aware of. Often an idea will come I've never written particularly autobiographically, but often something will happen in your own life that will set off at a preoccupation, like becoming a parent for me was a big deal. The death of my father was a big deal. My father died halfway through the writing of a novel. I was writing my fourth novel, Us, which was a novel about family. But the first time I tried to write about family, and it was always going to be a novel about marriage. And during the writing process, my father became ill and then died, and suddenly it changed the whole course of the novel, and it didn't become autobiographical. If anything, there's nothing in that book that's real life. There's nothing in that book that happened. Certainly, no character in that book is remotely like my father or my relationship with my father, and yet it opened up a whole set of preoccupations that I hadn't necessarily anticipated. So often you'll become preoccupied with an idea in your real life that you have to try and convert into fiction, and that is very unpredictable. I'd hate to wish for something to happen just so I have something to write about, but it's undeniably true that though I've never written directly autobiographically, experiences of loneliness or unrequited love or family tension or all of those things are a kind of catalyst to what you end up writing. So I guess it's a long way of saying external stimulus, books and films and TV that I love, personal experience though transmuted into fiction, and a sense of reader or viewer response, a sense of wanting the reader or the viewer to feel a particular way, to have a particular feeling in the heart after they've finished the story. All of those things are important to me.
I'm sure I can speak for all of us and say that we certainly do, after.
Well, it doesn't always work. Sometimes you kind of miss it, or it doesn't quite convert, or you don't quite get the response you anticipated. But anyway.
And what project that you've worked on are you most proud of?
Oh well, I guess I'm proud of I'm proud of not having worked on One Day. I guess what I'm proud of with the Netflix One Day is finding a way to collaborate with people that's extremely frank and honest, and often involves criticism. I mean, you're all at an age where you're being exposed to criticism that's perhaps harsher and more demanding than you've experienced thus far in your life, and certainly when you make things, you get that all the time. People saying this just doesn't work, or this isn't funny, or I don't like this speech, or it's really, really hard, and often people don't handle that very well, and that's why it's common for people to storm out or be sacked, or for things to go sour, or to be confrontational, aggressive. It's very stressful. It's very, very, very stressful, particularly working in film and television. Publishing is a little different, but film and television can be extremely fraught. And I working on One Day, I think that's by far the most, the happiest and most collaborative and creative experience I've had. I'm working with people a lot younger than me as well, and finding a way to communicate and to listen to actors and take on board their responses and make changes, not in a begrudging way, but in a kind of a thoughtful and collaborative way. That has been really great. And in terms of things that I can actually watch without too much pain, I'm very fond of Patrick Melrose, which is by far the most was a really important project for me, because it really wasn't my natural tone of voice. I don't know how many of you saw it, but it's really dark.
It's very dark.
It's very dark. It's about addiction and childhood abuse and trauma and all of those things. But I loved the book so much, and I worked with a really fantastic director, Ed Berger, who's just made Conclave and All Quiet on the Western Front, and we had a very good collaboration. So if I had to pick three, I'd probably say Melrose, the recent Netflix One Day, just because of the atmosphere of the production, and Far From the Madding Crowd. With the books, it's always the most recent one, because that's the one that you've worked that's freshest. And I think You Are Here, will never sell as many copies as One Day, but to my mind is a much better written book. There's often a distinction to be made between the work you put into a piece of writing and how proud you are of it sentence by sentence, the quality of the writing, the fact that you've really made demands for yourself and really edited it very thoroughly and been extremely careful and poured in all of your heart and hours and hours and hours of labour, and how people respond to it. Often the things that you work hardest at don't spark in a way that you predicted or you hoped. I'm very fond of my fifth novel, Sweet Sorrow, and it really didn't sell many copies. It was a bit of a flop, but I poured everything into that book, and you can't do anything when that happens. You can't do anything except shrug and get on to the next thing. But I'm proud of the last three novels. The first three, I have notes.
I have three final questions before the Q&A. What has been the most challenging moment of your career so far?
Oh, well, you have a lot of flops, and I love, for instance, I love film, and I've made 6 films now, and with no one's fault but my own, but none of them, apart from maybe Far From the Madding Crowd, quite landed the way I wanted them to. And I'd love to write a film that really flew. When you're in a cinema and most people are really enjoying the film, and it's a communal experience, that's really exciting. And I don't know if I've ever quite had that. And so I do want to keep writing for film as opposed to television, much as I love television. Quite often the work has stopped. Like I said, Sweet Sorrow didn't do very well, even though I thought it was by far the best thing I'd written. My first writing job, you're all so young, so you won't remember this, but there was a TV show called Cold Feet in the 90s, which I worked on as a kind of writer for hire. And because my episodes were okay, I got my own show, a show called Rescue Me, and which is literally before you were born. And that kind of flopped. That was really hard. In those days, it was a very tangible sense of failure the next day when the viewing figures came through, and you realised that you had got half of what you hoped for, what you needed to be recommissioned. So there have been various times I've been working as a writer full time for about 25 years now. There have been several times where it's just stopped completely, and I've had nothing to do, no work, and things have done badly, and I've suddenly become unemployable. And those experiences are really frightening and unnerving. And yes, like I said, the only thing you can do is just do the next thing.
What are you most excited about in the current film industry?
Oh, I think there's some really fantastic writer-directors. I've never quite had the guts to direct myself, and I know that if I have a regret looking back, it'll be that. But Charlotte Wells and Molly Manning Walker and those director-writers, they're not writing scripts in the conventional way. They're not writing scripts that you could present to an executive, and an executive would say, well, this is a perfectly written, beautiful script, let's make it. They're always working with cinematographers and actors on set in a very improvisatory, creative way. And I think that kind of writer directing can be really, really exciting. And I guess, I think also the fact that everyone has the means of production in their pockets now. I think, again, I don't know how many of you have aspirations to write or direct, but the big, deep breath you've got to take is actually just to make the things, just to make the things, even if you're making them in a prototype form, even if you never show them to anyone, even if they're just a learning tool. Use the camera on your phone, and you will learn so much. When I started out, the hardest thing was to get to the stage where you were watching things on the screen, and often then it was too late to realise that it wasn't working, it wasn't right, that your dialogue was too heightened or too arch or too verbose, that it wasn't believable, that it was too broad. Often you wouldn't find that out until it was about to be broadcast, that a scene was just lousy. And so to do as much of that kind of experimentation by yourself privately, I think is a gift that everyone has now, which I didn't really have when I started out.
And finally, if you met yourself at the start of your career with all the advice and knowledge you have now, what would you say to yourself? What advice would you give?
Oh well, there's a line in One Day where he says, if I could give you anything, it would be the gift of confidence. And it's probably that really. It took a lot of kind of umming and ahhing and anxiety before I thought actually this is okay. This can definitely be made better, but it's okay to show and to share. And that can be the biggest hurdle I think for writers, is to take that leap and take a chance and share your work. But ultimately that's why we write. I mean, of course, there's a value, not of course, but perhaps there is a value to writing entirely privately. But we write to be read, or in the case of a screenplay, to be shown. So I would encourage myself to be a little bit more confident, and I would also encourage myself to stick to my guns. Really, if I think about the early stuff I did, there were all kinds of compromises. Moments where I said, okay, that's fine, do it like that, or it's okay, I'm not quite sure about that performance, but let's go with it, or I really don't want to lose that scene, but if the budget isn't working, let's cut the scene. And most of the time, I was right, and I regretted conceding. So I would encourage my younger self to stick to my guns a little bit firmer and not worry so much about upsetting or irritating people. I really don't like confrontation. I don't like arguing. And sometimes you have to argue and you have to say, no, I'm not going to do that. And I'm right. Of course, I have sometimes done that and been wrong, and often very expensively wrong. Those scenes that I've insisted we shoot this scene, we have to have this scene, and then sat in the edit suite and realised it's nonsense, it's not funny, it doesn't work. But it's still worth doing.
Thank you so much for your wisdom. That's extremely, very nice for us to hear all of that. Passing on to the Q&A, does anyone have any questions?
Hi.
Thank you for your talk. It was wonderful. We're English students, and my main question is, do you have a period of literature that really inspires you, or do you just go for it? Or?
Oh, it changes all the time. Period of literature. I mean, we were talking earlier. So much of my writing work is founded on my O-level texts, my A-level texts. Reading Great Expectations and Far from the Madding Crowd and Tess. One Day comes from Tess, and so much of my work comes from Great Expectations, and Forster's Howard's End is a book that I've gone to over and over again and drawn from, just in its discussion of class and culture and how those things interact. And this isn't a period of literature, but definitely the books I read between about 15 and 21 had a profound effect on me. And if I'd had different A-level set texts, I'd have written different books and films. There's something about those stories that really went into me at a very deep level, and which I've drawn from again and again and again. The relationship between Pip and what's his brother-in-law called? Sorry? Joe, yeah, the relationship between Pip and Joe. Sorry, that's how much I love it. I've forgotten the names. Is something that I've sort of sat from, and the relationship between Pip and Estella is something that I'm always drawing on. And Adrian Mole is a sort of seminal work for me. It's a book I've gone back to over and over again and been influenced by. So it's not a period of literary history, it's a period of personal history. And because of the time in which I studied English literature, it's predominantly male writers and predominantly 19th century male writers, but they did have a powerful effect on me. Now I'm much more influenced by, I guess if I'm drawing on anything now, I have great love of kind of late 20th century social comedy by writers like Muriel Spark, Anita Bruckner. Anita Bruckner is a big influence on you, I hear. Penelope Fitzgerald is a writer I absolutely love. And so probably late 20th century, mid to late 20th century social comedians like that. I'm very influenced by. Yeah. And American fiction, you know, there's a kind of sort of poignancy and lyricism in Scott Fitzgerald that I really love, and Salinger, you know, I read in my 20s, and I'm always stealing from Franny and Zooey, and you know, because he's the great writer of adolescence and adolescent idealism and lost hopes, and so I love that, and the melancholy you find in those books. So that's a big influence as well. Hi, there's the two at the back.
I really love the playlists you make
Oh,
with
yeah.
characters. That's so fun, and I was wondering how you sort of go about constructing them, and do you listen to them while you're writing?
Yeah, I guess music is very, very important to me as a writer, yeah, because often you kind of feel something in a song that you want to put on the page, and I find that happens again and again. And also, you know, the only thing I got from my time as an actor was a kind of sense of creating a character. And often, you know, when we meet someone quite early on in the conversation, we'll talk about our favourite films and our favourite books, but particularly our favourite music, because music is an expression of character and the part of the character that we want to present and share to people. So when I'm writing a novel, I will spend a very long time, often a year or two, just writing notes about the characters, so I know everything about them. And a big part of that is their musical taste, as well as how they dress and their background and what their parents do and all of that stuff, the kind of stuff an actor does in preparing a character. So music is a big part of that, and when I was writing One Day, there were definitely chapters that were written to music. You know, there's a chapter where Dexter kind of has a breakdown in the club, and I wrote that by hand very, very fast, listening to very loud techno. I don't do that now because I can't listen to music while I drive a car, so I certainly can't do it while I'm writing. But the musical taste of my characters is one of the first things I have to decide. And as my grip on contemporary musical culture has slightly weakened as I've got older, I probably don't do it as much as I did when I started. When I started, I absolutely wanted, that on Spotify there's an Emma Morley, not just a playlist, but there's Emma Morley's record collection, which is everything she done, and Dexter's as well. And my own taste is much more Emma's, but it's important that I can also know what Dexter's listening to and sharing as well. So certainly, yeah, in the past that's been a big part of my writing. I'm trying to do it less now, and in the latest novel, You Are Here, there's a section where they run out of things. It's a love story that takes place on a long walk, and there's a bit where they run out of things to say, and so they play a game which is that they take each other's phone and they shuffle their record collection, their music collections, but everything, not just the good bits, not the bits that you show off about, but the bits that you're a bit embarrassed by. And they respond and comment on each other's music collection, everything. So the music in the book, like One Day, is usually it's music I love, and the music in You Are Here, it's music that I often actively dislike. So I'm trying to be less, in other words, I'm trying to be less kind of proselytizing about the music I like. But it always sneaks in, writers are always doing it. When they put in their epigraphs, they're always, it's a way of telling the reader, this is something I love. And I think that's okay. But yeah, no, it is very important to me. Though I don't write to it anymore. When we did One Day, one of my, not demands, but requests was that I was able to collaborate quite extensively with Matt Biffer, who was the music coordinator. So a lot of the music choices in that were worked out with me and Matt collaboratively. Yes.
Hi, thank you for coming. One Day was one of the most, I think, emotionally impactful stories I've ever seen. Would you be able to identify any sort of specific variables that create such an impact?
Oh, well, I guess I sort of did want it to be a big kind of emotional ride, and I wanted it to be kind of, a romantic comedy that became something else. And I suppose the structure of that helped really. The sense of, again, it's stolen from Hardy. Hardy is always talking about, Hardy's a very, very fatalistic writer. The premise of One Day comes from a passage in Tess where she feels a shiver down her spine, looks in the mirror, and wonders if this day has a particular significance. You know, whether this is a day whose meaning lies sly and unseen in the calendar. And that was the feeling. That was the feeling I wanted to get into the book, and that's where the structural idea for the book kind of came from. The idea that you'll take, rather than show, when you tell a love story, usually you reach for the expected moments in a relationship. You know, the first kiss, the first I love you, the engagement, the wedding day, all of those things. And that structure seems to, why not leave all of those off the page? Why not push them all off the page and instead write about ordinary life? And so I guess there's a sense of poignancy in that you're witnessing these sort of snapshots, and that, I don't know, I was writing at a time where I was very kind of, some unexpected things had happened, and I wanted that unexpectedness to be in there as well, in the sense that a lack of control, a lack of predictability to life. So that's what I wanted to put on the page. I mean, I was talking earlier about how often when you set out on a project, you carry with you the response you want the reader to have, and I always wanted it to be a kind of you'll laugh, you cry feeling, and a kind of Hardy-esque sense of what if is part of that. You know, the first chapter in Tess is Angel sees Tess without realizing the significance that she'll have later in his life, and contemplates dancing with her and doesn't. And so immediately you're thinking, these moments are all the way through Hardy. You know, if only he'd danced with her, if only her father hadn't bumped into the parson, if only the letter hadn't gone under the doormat, if only, if only, if only. So One Day was very much intended as a kind of if only novel. And that was the, often, if you start with a strong structural idea like that and find ways to make it work, and that's probably why I think, you know, not for everyone, but why it kind of, it does what it set out to do.
Thank you.
Hi. Sorry, that's all right. Yes.
Yeah. So hi, thank you so much for that. That was really amazing. So as an author, I think it must be hard to detach yourself from your characters. I wonder if you're ever going through life and you like find yourself thinking, oh, Dexter and Emma would have enjoyed doing this, or such and such thing would have made Dexter think of Emma. Or like perhaps is it easier to leave Dexter and Jasmine on Arthur's seat? Like,
Yeah.
which one do you think?
I don't, no, I never quite do that thing of thinking them as living independent lives after it's written. No, I'm quite steely about that. I mean, I'm very aware of it being not an apparatus, but, you know, a kind of structure that ends, and I spend, you know, there's a long process of writing, and then there's a process where you talk about the book and the characters for quite a long period of time, and then I put them to one side. I guess what I would say was that with the Netflix One Day, I so loved Ambika and Leo, and when they asked me to write an episode, the chapters in the novel that corresponded to that episode were no good. I read them back for the first time since I'd written them, and they didn't seem to contain enough drama or enough event or enough dialogue. So I was writing for them anew, and it was really lovely to kind of revisit these people, but revisit them in the form of Ambika and Leo, because by then we'd cast the actors and I'd seen their audition tapes and I knew their tics and their voices and their personalities, and so it was lovely to revive them. But I'm not a fan of sequels, and I don't think I'll ever go back to any of the characters. No, I'm quite pragmatic about that. Hi.
I guess kind of as a receiver of audience feedback rather than the writer, you know, kind of after you put it out.
Yeah.
I did. Obviously, One Day's come out 3 different times in a way, book, film,
Yeah,
show.
yeah.
What would you say the kind of differences are in those 3? Because obviously social media and things like that has all kind of changed.
Yes.
And also, how relevant do you think the times that each of them came out in is to the way that the audience perceives it? Like, could One Day the show have come out?
Oh, I think again, you know, the books belong to the time and they're written in, and there are things in One Day that I guess One Day came out about the same time as sort of The Office and things like that. A kind of comedy of not cruelty but of embarrassment and awkwardness, and it was also meant to be a kind of response to the whole 90s, the kind of lad culture Britpop thing. And so quite often, particularly in the character of Dexter, there's a kind of satirical quality that I really don't like. and I loved that Nicole stripped a lot of that away and made Dexter a little bit more rounded. And this isn't just Nicole, it's also Leo, a little bit more sympathetic, and kind of curbed his excesses, not in a compromising way, but in a way that makes more sense now, I think. I think often that can be a frustration. You know, you look back at things, certainly there are things in Start for 10 that I'm mortified by and really dislike violently, both in the book and the film. But that isn't necessarily always apparent at the time. You know, just things that are a bit too broad, or a bit too silly, or not grounded, or excessive. And it's one of. I went to meet some. It was the people behind Kobo, which is, you know, the rival to Kindle, and they said they were trying to persuade. I wasn't a digital reader, and they were trying to persuade me of the benefits of digital reading. And they said, of course, what you realize, you as a writer can always tweak. You can always fix your books. You can always go back and, you know, everyone's reader will be updated with the new version. You can take out that joke that doesn't really work, or that scene which is a bit cringy, and it's terribly appealing. But it's like going back and airbrushing your photographs. You know, you have to accept that each of them belong to their time, and learn from that and try and get better. You know, I don't think I'll probably write anything that's as successful as One Day, but I'm very proud of it. But I think I've probably learned a lot as a writer since, and have applied those lessons, and will continue to do so. I don't think you ever get to a point where you think, I know how to do it now. You know, you should retain a certain amount of humility with your writing, and always learn from the things that don't quite land. Hello.
Hi, I just wanted to start by saying that Sweet Sorrow is actually my favourite book of yours.
Good.
So
Thank you. Sweet Sorrow.
but yeah, and kind of following on sort of about that, and about your sort of the books that are set kind of before you've written them. I always find that your books have like a really keen sense of nostalgia, and I think you do really well at grounding books and the films in that sense of time. So I was going to ask, sort of, what's the biggest challenge with grounding sort of books in a past time?
Yeah, it's interesting, because when Sweet Sorrow came out, I didn't read reviews, but I foolishly glanced at one that said, you know, they're all about nostalgia, and they're all about looking back, and it's just like, you know, write about the present day. And with You Are Here, I thought, well, I will do that. It's a fair criticism, because there is a kind of, you know, algia means ache, and nostalgia doesn't necessarily have these warm, fuzzy feelings. Often it can be a sadness about the past. And with You Are Here, I definitely set out to write a book set in the present, but because it's just two characters and it takes place in isolation, it's by no means a sort of State of the Nation novel. It's very much a chamber piece. So I think I need to probably, with the next book, engage slightly more with the world around me. With Sweet Sorrow, I didn't want to write about my youth, because my youth is not 1997, it's 1997, mine is 1982. So I thought it was a useful exercise to try and, I of course remember 1997, but I don't remember what it felt like to be 16 then. And that seemed to me to be a way to snap out of certain patterns I had as a writer, or of just digging into my own memories and trying to imagine someone else's memories. But music is really central to that, and I definitely had a lot of playlists and a lot of background music and a lot of music in my head, because 1997 is a very, I dread to think how old you all were in 1997 if you were even born, but it was a very particular atmosphere. And I look at a lot of the culture, I look at the TV listings, I listen to the music, and try and then combine that with my own memories of what it felt like to be kind of frightened of the future at that age, and to try and combine the two, to lay what I know onto a period of time that I experienced rather differently.
Sorry, I just have one more question.
Yes.
So you mentioned, you know, you work with music coordinators, and
Yeah.
a lot of your shows and movies have very iconic soundtracks, and I just wondered what this process is like for you.
Oh, well, usually what happens is for me, so very brief, I realise we're going over time. So what happens in the edit, you get sent all the rushes, you get sent rough cuts of the scenes, and you have this wonderful device which allows you to loop a scene. So it just plays round and round and round. And then what I do is I set up the scene, I loop it, and then I just play lots of songs, you know, just see how they match. See, you know, there's a bit in the final episode of One Day where it plays Jeff Buckley's Live Wine. Yeah, oh my God. And sitting down, watching that scene over and over and over again, trying all kinds of songs on it. We had a Fleetwood Mac on it, we had all kinds of things on it, and then pressing play on the Jeff Buckley and realizing that it was almost as if it was cut to that song. And it really wasn't. We didn't change a frame, but everything, the timing of the opening of the door and going up the stairs, everything corresponded absolutely perfectly to the song. There's another one earlier in the series, the Velvet Underground track, on Primrose Hill. And again, I just looped the scene round and round and round and played lots of different Velvet Underground songs. And that one fits absolutely perfectly. And you get this real thrill. You want to rush in the edit suite and say, look at this, it fits so well. And then they always say, well, I'm afraid that's going to cost £40,000. Because, you know, music coordinators have very particular rules, and it's always like, no Beatles, no Kate Bush, no Rolling Stones, because they're all too expensive. So I personally, as a viewer, like soundtracks that are slightly off the obvious. So we knew that when we did 1997, we weren't going to have Spice Girls. You know, we were going to have different music. And also, this is the last thing I'll say, but in the same way that none of us are wearing clothes that we bought in 2025, we don't necessarily listen to music from the same year. So for me, the sound of 1988 is Joan Alma Trading from 1971. So, you know, digging into the past and acknowledging the character's nostalgia was a really important part of it as well. So they don't always listen, we don't always use the soundtrack music from the year in which the episode is set. Quite often we'll go back to the 60s or 70s, and because that's music as an expression of character, not as a reflection of period of time.
Thank you so much. I don't know if there's any more questions, but
No,
I
but
don't want to
thank
keep you. I
Thank
think
you
it's
so
been
much for
amazing.
coming.
You've learned
I'm
so
really
much.
pleased to see everyone here. I hope that's been useful. If I haven't answered anything and you do want me a more specific response, you can always contact me on Instagram. But thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.